Welcome to Regulate Tech. This is our 11th episode of the year with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and
with me, Richard Allan.
Excellent. So there's been a lot of talk about a small messaging service with around 145 million daily users. That's hardly enough to get venture capital anymore in Silicon Valley. But the name of the service happens to be Twitter, and it's being acquired. So tell us what the brouhaha is about, Richard.
Yeah. So the I think the brouhaha partly depends on personality, because the man who's buying or has raised the funds and is trying to complete a purchase of Twitter is Elon Musk, who is a very prominent public figure. So it's partly just anything that Elon Musk touches is going to create brouhaha and noise. I think most of those 145 million daily user followers of his. So he's kind of speaking to his own audience there. And then partly there's a more substantive question, which is, look, what direction is this platform going to go in if he does manage to take it over? Because if he takes it private, I mean, he'll be beholden to his bankers, but he's not beholden to the markets in the classic sense. And he will have a lot more latitude to do things with or to Twitter and its users than a normal, publicly listed company might have, where they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders and they tend to be more cautious. So that's put onto the table lots of different things about where he may go with the business model, with the rules around speech. So lots of questions which he himself is feeding with regular pronouncements about where is Twitter going to go once it becomes a private company, assuming that does happen, run by this idiosyncratic, well-known public figure, Elon Musk.
Yes, that sets us up for an interesting discussion, and certainly has put him in the public eye, to the extent that I saw that he was invited today, or if it was yesterday, to come to the UK Parliament and explain his plans. Isn't that right?
That's right. Yeah. So they want him to go, and it'd be again interesting for me as a professional observer, having sort of sat next to Mark Zuckerberg's empty chair, and we've talked about it in previous episodes around committee hearings that look for Mark Zuckerberg. Certainly, my recommendation was never that he should necessarily come in front of the committees because there's a lot of risk involved. We've talked through all of that. I suspect Elon Musk has a different risk appetite, and again, because we're not talking about a publicly listed company, he may think, oh, I'll just come to the UK Parliament and tell them what I think and shoot from the hip, and that would be an interesting session. So let's see. It's a kind of early indication of how he intends to do things. If he says no, that suggests, a bit like recommendations we've made, that he thinks this is a distraction from the main event. If he says yes, then it tells us he perhaps wants to be more of a showman with this thing and just come and have a platform and tell everybody what he thinks.
I think the early indications was that he thought it was slightly premature to do it now. He wanted the deal to close first, but certainly did not exclude the opportunity or the option. So let's see where that ends up. Now, one of the things that he has said is that he believes that Twitter has restricted content far too much in his view, and there are a couple of different things here. There's one strain of thought, or sort of one analysis, that says that, okay, what Elon Musk is going to try to do is to bring Twitter back to the days when it described itself as the free speech wing of the free speech party. Quite an aggressive rhetoric at the time. Do you think that is what's in the cards, that he wants to turn back time and go back to the old, more cyber libertarian view of free speech?
I mean, that would be completely cutting across the direction of travel from policymakers over the last few years, and actually the direction of travel of all the platforms as they've become more societally important. The pressure has been on them to deal with things that are believed to be socially harmful, and there's a whole range of different things, from election interference through to fake news, through to anti-vax content, through to hate speech, and all of those have been present on all of the platforms, including Twitter. And the pressure is clearly there, and it's expressed in legislation in the UK and the EU, and the Online Safety Bill and the Digital Services Act. There's a very clear shift towards saying, let's take more control of these platforms and get them to do more to tidy up what we deem to be harmful speech. In the US, that's not expressed in legislative terms, but it's certainly there. There's a lot of pressure on the platforms, again, to deal with things that people see as inherently harmful. So that's the direction of travel that I think they've all been going in. Even platforms like Reddit and others that were known as very, very permissive you can see that they've shifted. They have a bigger trust and safety team and more of a focus on that. They may not be getting rid of all the speech, but they're being more considerate or careful about how they manage speech on their platforms. So I think the question really for what Elon Musk is saying is, okay, is he saying thus far and no further, or is he literally saying let's roll back some of the attempts that have been made in order to manage speech better? And if he's saying roll back, then he is swimming in the opposite direction to the tide. And we all know how that can be. Swimming opposite to the tide is a tiring business, and you risk getting swept away and drowned. And so, question, is Elon Musk strong enough to swim against the tide? Should he attempt to do that? Or will the tide sweeping him away? And the tide is, I say, absolutely clearly in favor of, I think, platforms doing more to restrict speech, not doing less to restrict speech.
And you could even see some early flags of this when Thierry Breton, the commissioner, gave an interview in which he said, Elon, we have rules here. I think that was more or less the quote, and you have to obey them if you want to be in the European market. Raising the specter of a ban from the European market if he did not comply with the rules in, for example, the Digital Services Act. So there seems to be some tension and friction there. But there's another analysis that you can apply to what he's been saying. And we can apply lots of different kinds of analysis to what he's been saying, because there's a rich amount of content there. But another thing that he has been saying is that he would like to transform Twitter into something new. And there are two components to this new model that has been floated in some of his tweets. One, I think, is fundamentally very much different from where we were back in the 1990s. And that is the idea that he wants to authenticate all human beings on the planet, essentially. I think he put that like that and said he wants to authenticate everyone. So everyone would be verified and speak under their own name in Twitter. That's not rolling back to the free speech wing of the free speech party, is it?
Well, I mean, that's very much in line with where governments like the UK are going. They would love to see that. I think the UK and the European Union. Well, the European Union would be more mixed, because they certainly I think have some issues around privacy and authentication. But the UK, yes, if Twitter suddenly authenticate everyone, that's actually one of the strands of the online safety bill, is to try and encourage platforms to do more to authenticate people, in the hope that will limit some of the harmful speech. So from a free speech point of view, authentication, I mean, people will argue it both ways. I think you quoted before, is it Simone de Beauvoir, who kind of said, you should be allowed to say whatever you want to say, as long as you
Simone Weil, yes.
Simone Weil, sorry, Simone Weil. You said you should be able to say whatever you want to say, as long as you say it under your own identity. So arguably, Elon Musk could say, look, I'm absolutely going in the free speech direction by saying, I'm going to require you to authenticate, but having authenticated, you can say what you want to say. Now, that in the US context potentially still is quite permissive of speech, because the US allows a broad range of speech. So you could in the US authenticate under your own name and spout the vilest hate speech possible and still not be at risk of prosecution, because it's not illegal in the US. Now, the same applied in Europe is a real problem. And actually, the reason that governments like the UK would like people to self-authenticate is that they believe that once they've authenticated, they will self-censor, because they will be worried about breaking the law and getting prosecuted. So this authentication thing will work very differently in the US and the UK, for example. In the US, yes, authentication, you can argue, is independent of speech, because the speech is legal. I don't know if people, would change their behavior if they're more identifiable, but certainly they will know that nothing can happen to them in terms of the police coming to the door. Once you've authenticated in a country like the UK or in Europe, and actually a country like Germany, where, speech laws can be very restrictive, then that has huge speech implications, because there's a whole range of speech you're now going to be nervous about issuing in case it results in a prosecution.
Yes, and it's quite the turn away also from the early internet view of anonymity as essential to the kind of freedom that the internet presented. Anonymity preserving technologies like encryption, etc., have been woven into this narrative that this is a place where you can start anew, where you don't have to come with all of the luggage of your old offline identity. You can try out new identities. You can try out new pseudonymous existences and develop your own understanding of the world through that. But authenticating everyone would create a very specific public sphere, at least with some accountability. The other thing that he has said that I thought was interesting and hasn't been picked up that much is that he said he thought Twitter should be a protocol rather than a service. And you can read this in many different ways, but what do you think what's sort of in his mind there, if we do a little bit of Elon Musk psychology?
Yeah, I mean, I wondered, the other thing that he's very famous for is being very interested in cryptocurrencies, and so you can kind of see, I could just see there's a general shift towards this sort of notion that we create these structures that are independent of government. So a lot of the appeal of crypto is we want to supposedly liberate ourselves from these banking systems and things. And I could see perhaps a philosophy for me. It's quite a libertarian philosophy or an anti-government philosophy that says, let's make Twitter an infrastructure for authentication and other things. And you can imagine somebody who's now using Twitter as their communications infrastructure. They're using Twitter authentication instead of government IDs and things like that. And they're using cryptocurrencies instead of fiat currencies. And I just wonder if there's some sort of mix there where he's looking at this as a way of creating this alternative infrastructure that is independent and outside government. And for that to be the case, you have to say, like a lot of the cryptocurrencies, these are their protocols as opposed to being entirely in the control of an individual company. So I just think there may be something that's sort of lining up there in his mind. And from a government point of view,
that's
again,
intriguing.
Yeah. I mean, it cuts right across where governments are going.
I just want to dig into that a bit, because there's something there that I think is really intriguing, because what you're saying is that he might just have bought Twitter to turn it into the biggest crypto exchange on the internet, where people could be authenticated and they could exchange views as well as exchange different kinds of financial tokens. So he would have bought the network and then slowly turned it into this vehicle for finance, essentially.
Yeah, and as I say, in creating a world, I think there's a kind of libertarian position, a classic almost Silicon Valley libertarian position, which says, let's get rid of those weary giants of steel and flesh. Let's liberate ourselves from it. And everything that Elon Musk does, you feel he's got that mindset. And so Twitter may be a vehicle
heavily subsidized by the government, though, one would note.
Yes, heavily subsidized, certainly in terms of some of the stuff that he's built. But again, I mean, interestingly, first he cuts across where governments are going. He could then try and position Twitter as, all of these other, schmucks, the Facebooks and the Googles and people, they're all now, towing the line and signed up to all the government regulation. And I've created something that's kind of outside of that and independent. The challenge he faces is if you look at the legislation, he's not going to be given that option, or Twitter will not be given that option unless it radically re-engineers itself into something different. As long as Twitter, in UK terms, meets the definition of a user-to-user service, Twitter is going to have to pay money to the UK regulator and under the DSA to the European Commission. And the European Commission and the UK regulator Ofcom are going to have the right to give Twitter directions about a whole range of different things they do within their business. He may decide, I want everyone to authenticate. Well, the UK government is going to decide whether or not that authentication is sufficient. And if it's not, they're going to tell them to do it differently. And again, everything about Elon tells you, I don't think he's going to be too excited about paying a government bureaucrat to tell him how to design his service. But that's absolutely the world that, it's there in black and white. You can see that's where we're heading. So again, really interesting set of questions, whether ultimately he will back down, and if he is running it, and say, fine, do what you like, or whether he would try and re-engineer the service to try and get it outside of the definitions, or say, I'm not going to offer my service in those countries who are stupid enough to bring in these stupid laws, which again is very, if you followed, his sort of arguments around California and COVID and shutting down his Tesla factories, that's pretty much what he said then. It's like, you Californians are stupid. I'll go to Texas. So again, consistent with that, maybe Twitter will be the first major service that says, I'm pulling out of the UK and European markets. And
Which would be interesting given that only around 15 to perhaps 20% of its users are in the US.
yeah,
So it would be a fairly heavy reduction of usage, I think. But the other thing about protocols is that you can imagine him, we can almost imagine this working like the old news servers worked, a federated system of servers that are open sourced and run some kind of messaging protocol in a, for lack of a better term, peer-to-peer like fashion.
yeah.
And then there is no central company anymore. There is no there for the DSA or the Online Safety Act. So is that something that you think he's been considering when he talks about the protocol level as where Twitter should go?
Yeah, so that sort of Twitter becomes Mastodon in some way, which is if people aren't familiar, it's a peer-to-peer sort of information sharing service is often touted or cited as an alternative to Twitter, but depends on federated service. I mean, he could go there. I guess there is a business left. Again, if the business develops in terms of we're giving you an authentication service, and the authentication service is central and viable and has some kind of revenue stream, and people are paying a subscription to be an authenticated user, then I guess there's still some some business left, even if all the action takes place at a federated level where you're no longer able to control it. So that's one possible model. I have to say, though, that the online safety bill does not have a de minimis provision as yet for the servers that will be caught. And it said, at the moment, the estimate is around 25,000 services. So I guess there'll be some that are too small. But if your service is targeted at the UK and has a significant number of UK users, they want you to be in scope. So somebody who was running a federated server using the Twitter protocol, that person, whichever entity is running that federated server, if they're servicing UK users, they're still going to be subject to the requirements of the online safety bill. Different requirements for smaller platforms, but still, quite material requirements. So in that world, it may be Twitter, the central authenticator, avoids responsibility for all this user content enforcement stuff. But the organizations running the individual federated servers will still be caught within European and UK legislation.
Unless they're decentralized to the user level, where every user runs, in conjunction with its messaging service, a small version of that server. So it's sort of completely decentralized. That's something that I think would raise a very different kind of discussion with governments, and that is, how decentralized will they allow a platform to become? Is there a lower bound of decentralization beyond which people will sort of start to raise their hand and say, this won't work?
I mean, that's an interesting one for lawyers. I mean, a platform of one, I think, hardly qualifies as a platform. so you imagine the lawyer saying you're no longer a platform. Now you're a sender. Now you're a publisher, actually. Having said that, you then become an individual publisher rather than a platform at all. So yes, you're right. There's some architectures that go all that way. That would be super radical, but I say the federated model where there's still an aggregation, I think is still clearly user to user. You're facilitating communications of some users with other users. If it's just you communicating, I think you are in a different world. You're then the individual end user.
And we might end up in a world where we see similarities with the way that the BitTorrent protocol works, that you have a search engine that's centralized some way to find the torrents, and that then becomes the point of control, for example, even if the torrents are highly distributed. So the protocol path is one that will be interesting to keep track of. So just generally, the obvious big question that everyone has been talking about is whether or not Donald Trump should return to the platform, and it's especially now, that's an interesting question. Now he's been negative, right? He doesn't want to return.
He said he wants to keep boosting his own platform, Truth.social, and I think,
and it's going to be called Truthing. I understand.
Truthing, right?
You're truthing.
Yeah, which means by definition the thing is truthful. That's all you need.
Yes,
I say it's true, therefore it is true. It's a kind of interesting twist. But no, I think he said he doesn't want to go back in. Again, I think the other sort of unfinished business is whether social media platforms are ultimately going to end up like newspapers in Europe or TV news stations in the US, having a very clear political bias and becoming homes for people either from the left or from the right, but very rarely from both. And clearly with True Social, the intention of Donald Trump is to create a conservative Twitter, if you can put it that way. And then the question becomes, the original notion of a Twitter and a Facebook was it's neither conservative nor liberal. It's for everyone. And I think what you've seen, there's been a lot of tension, and the Donald Trump banning was a classic example of where people say, well, if you ban Donald Trump, therefore you are now liberal Twitter or liberal Facebook. Therefore, we must go and build conservative Twitter or conservative Facebook, and conservative Twitter originally was Parler, I guess, was the one that everyone was going to. But Donald Trump's clearly said, look, he wants to build conservative Twitter as True Social. I don't think there's any pretense that it's appealing to liberals. He knows his constituency. Question then, does Elon Musk, if he gets hold of Twitter, does he say, I'm going to make it a liberal Twitter or a conservative Twitter or a libertarian Twitter or whatever? Does he sort of feel comfortable, or is he going to try and sustain universality? And sustaining universality is, frankly, as what's been giving these big platforms the biggest headaches, at least in the US, because trying to maintain universality is what's left them getting slammed from both sides. Conservatives think that they're too censorious, and liberals think they're not censorious enough.
Yeah. No, the only thing he said on that is that he thinks that success means that the 10% most extreme on the left and on the right should be equally unhappy with the service and the content moderation offered. So that seems to indicate that he is looking for universality. It raises an interesting question, though. I mean, if Truth Social becomes available in the UK, would that mean that Ofcom would have to make judgments about Truth Social's content moderation practices? And if they do, they would be making judgments about the content of a clearly politically biased service, but sort of one that's intentionally so. How does that work, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if it is a user-to-user service, offering people the ability to exchange content with each other, and if it is directed towards a significant number of people in the United Kingdom, absolutely, they will have to pay money to Ofcom and be regulated by Ofcom if that's what they want. So again, this is a really interesting example. They may be one of the first services to say, no, thank you. We'll just geo-block people from the UK from accessing our service. Because that would be, the logical kind of path for them to follow if they don't believe they should be regulated by a foreign entity. Of course, the regulation would only be in respect of the UK users. We should be clear about that. But they would then have to engineer some way of having different rules for the subset of UK users. And frankly, if the UK is not their target market, they may say, hang that. And UK users just use a VPN. Like we're gonna block it, so we don't have to be formally part of the thing. But if you're a arch Republican living in the UK, just get yourself a VPN, and then you can play all you like on it under US rules.
What if they were to provide the service? So I'm rat-holing on this a bit because I think it's fascinating. What if they were to provide a service outside of the US that was read-only? No ability to configure.
That really
would be a little bit like being able to see Fox News in the UK, right? But it's read-only. Rest of the world, read-only.
Yeah, if you were not able to interact with it, that's a really interesting. Oh, it's so good.
It is a really interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah, you go back and look at the definitions, but because the definitions really do focus on this, well, there is a notion of where you may encounter content, but that, so it talked about encountering content. I was walking down the internet in a northerly direction when I encountered some hate speech. It's sort of, so there is this sort of notion of encounter. People just sort of stumble upon it because they do want to capture that phenomenon. But to even be in scope at all, you have to have been offering a user-to-user service. So what I'm not sure about is if the definition would say, look, you are offering a user-to-user service because it's user-to-user somewhere else, and UK users can still encounter it, therefore you're in scope, or if the definitions would have to be that the UK users have to be able to access it as a user-to-user service before it even anything kicks in. So I think I'm going to go back to the definitions and have a look. You've asked a really interesting question.
Yes, I think that would be fascinating to know more about, and I also think it would be interesting because it would highlight a few of the other tensions there, which is how can you regulate another country's citizens, and if you can watch their political debate but not participate in it, then you tend to sort of solve a couple of adjacent problems as well around election integrity, etc., etc. So the read-only option might be at least to something like Truth Social that has a political bent and an appetizing idea. So we have Elon Musk buying Twitter. The deal hasn't gone through completely yet. There's a lot of questions open, and it is worthwhile asking if it's just Twitter we're focusing on, or if the reason that we have spent so much time as a society debating this is that we're at this inflection point where we really feel the need to understand free expression, free speech much more closely. Is Twitter become sort of a focal point for that discussion, do you think?
I think it has. I mean, I think it's really interesting because, I've had this experience working at Facebook that there was an expectation, different expectations are placed on different platforms. And there was an assumption, I think, for most of the time I was there, that Facebook was more family oriented and therefore had to apply a different standard from Twitter. And Twitter was seen as more a sort of professional, discerning audience, and therefore they could tolerate a slightly wilder environment. And then again, you take a platform like Reddit and it's wilder again. So there is a different set of expectations you get from policymakers for different platforms. I think Twitter is sort of become emblematic precisely because the expectations were high in favor of free speech. And therefore then it becomes the real sort of focal point.
Around 25% of the verified users are journalists, so it does have that profile that you describe. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no. I was actually going to make the same point. It's exactly that. It is both the fact that we have that expectation and the fact that the people who use it tends to be very heavily used by what we might call influencers. In the political policy sense, not in the fashion sense, but influencers in the political policy world, journalists, politicians are very, very heavy users of Twitter.
It's worth mentioning that if you look at usage patterns at Twitter, at least the US part of Twitter, some research seems to suggest that around 10% of the users write 80% of the tweets.
That's right.
So it's a heavy power law distribution along the users who are there. So it is to some degree, it's replicating a broadcast medium, right?
Exactly. And that, again, I think is a crucial difference that most of the other social media that we're talking about, or certainly to date, has tended to be narrowcast. So it's got broader over time, but certainly Facebook is quite narrowcast, and also classic social media, and Snapchat is used narrowcast. Actually, Instagram has some broadcasters on it. A lot of people use it in a very narrowcast way, and they use the messaging services and so on. YouTube arguably was more broadcast from the outset, and TikTok is more broadcast. But still, there'll be a lot of ordinary users of TikTok who are really using it to share funny videos, again, with quite a small circle of people. There's not a hope or an expectation that it's going to go out to the whole world. Whereas Twitter, I think, its raison d'etre was kind of broadcasting to the whole world. Again, people can use it narrowly, but most people who are using Twitter are really trying to get the biggest possible audience on that platform. And so it's default public and really geared towards trying to get your content retweeted by other people with large followers and get it out to as big an audience as possible.
Yeah, and so that's also why it becomes this focal point. We live in this time where there's a ton of attention paid to misinformation, to hate speech, to harmful speech, to all of these different kinds of issues that have to do with free speech. You have the DSA coming, you have the Online Safety Act, and now recently we also saw in the US that there's a special government authority being set up to deal with disinformation. That's interesting, isn't it? We've talked about the U.S. as being less focused on the content issue, but the Biden administration recently announced that they were going to organize a government body to look at mis and disinformation as as a core thing for dealing with. And I think this also comes a little bit in the shadow of the Ukraine war, for dealing with attacks on, for example, election integrity. So we live in this moment now that seems to be really crunch time for free expression, don't we?
Yeah, and again, perhaps not not surprising. It's the Biden administration that, again, we should be candid that mis and disinformation generally, and there are exceptions, but generally are seen to be tools of the right, and often the far right or extreme right that are used, and it's the left generally that will end up complaining about them and worrying about them. And again, we can see that across the piece on the vaccination front. It was seen as you sort of saw people generally on the left saying, we're going to take the vaccines, we're going to wear the masks, we're going to do all of that. And then feeling threatened by misinformation coming from people who tend to be politically on the right. It's not universal, but as a pattern, it's there, who are then, publish papers and things questioning the efficacy of vaccines and masks and so on. When it comes to elections, again, yes, generally speaking, it's been people on the left who've been complaining that the right is using misinformation to undermine the integrity of the elections and outcomes that they don't like. And I think certainly a certain amount of truth to that. If you look at, the aftermath of the first Trump win, when Hillary Clinton lost against expectation, you didn't see the Democrats sort of say, well, it's all the fault of corrupt election officials. And then you saw the second Trump election, and we know exactly what happened after that. There was a massive outpouring. And after every election, I've been involved in elections, your first reaction is, we was robbed. So the other guys must have cheated. But usually you kind of calm down and move on, and you realize it's your wounded pride and you move on. And I think the pattern that we've had, this really unusual moment where that process hasn't followed its normal path, where President Trump and his team would have been expected to whinge about it for a week and move on. No, they doubled down and tripled down and quadrupled down, and it just became the biggest thing, and then eventually led to violence in the Capitol, and it's still there, and that's just extraordinary. So again, it sort of makes it, from a political point of view, you do see in that is a prime example of people from one end of the political spectrum, the right, using misinformation, absolute lies, call them what they are, lies, in order to advance a false narrative that supports their view that the election was stolen, and doing it in a way that's really quite extraordinary. And then on the other side, you'll get a reaction from those, not all on the left, but generally from those who are opposed to that, who will often be on the left, saying, we must do something about this because these lies are having real world consequences. People are dying because of those lies.
And if we take a couple of steps back, it raises a question that we've been sort of circling around before, and that is, we've made this assumption, and the more free speech you have in a society, the more robust its democracy will be. And that assumption now seems to be something that more and more people are questioning. There's a recent book by this guy called Richard Hasen, for example, called Cheap Speech, in which he goes back to an article written in the late 1990s by Eugene Volokh. And the premise of the article is essentially this: it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to speak. Speech is becoming cheaper. And as an end result, we should expect that the usefulness of speech, the robustness of democracy generated by speech, will actually decline. It doesn't describe a linear curve that just increases over time, but it's more akin to a reversed U curve, where you have a maximum amount of speech that's conducive to a robust democracy. And after that point, when speech becomes too abundant, at least this seems to be the theory, it will actually start to harm democracy. What do you think about that? It's as a thought experiment. What do you think about that model?
I think it's a fascinating model, and it nicely uses the word cheap in both senses. Because I think he said that in that original article, cheap was used in the sense of inexpensive. And we've talked about that. What the internet does is it makes speech inexpensive. It makes it inexpensive to get out to a large audience. And then the other meaning of cheap, obviously, is of low value, worthless. And he's actually taken it in both senses. Says, yeah, in a sense, the fact that it is now inexpensive to speak has led to cheaper speech in the sense of lower value speech in the democratic sphere, and in particular that lower value, and tease out the word, but less good speech is pushing out and substituting for better speech. Essentially, that individuals promoting misinformation, lies, theories, that content is in some way displacing the expensive speech that was expensively written by experts, journalists, people in the media previously. And so I think it's a really interesting framing of what may be happening. There's also, but in the book and the way that he talks about it, I think there's quite a few things that are quite US specific, and I guess we're sort of exploring that. And perhaps he talks very much about always very much a reaction to what happened in the last couple of US political cycles. And maybe interesting is, again, as a thought experiment, to sort of compare that with other countries. Like France has just been through a presidential election, which I think took place in quite a different cultural context. And so some of these things are to do with the cheapness of the speech, or the technology making speech cheap. But quite a lot of the phenomena that we see are actually related to other aspects of the culture in which an election is taking place. It's worth sort of pulling those elements out.
And that makes a lot of sense. And I do think that he's very centered on the US and on the two elections, 2016, 2020 elections. And he sort of trying to think hard about how we can protect, if we can't protect democracy writ large, is there at least a way to protect the integrity of elections within the democratic framework? And he's quite unapologetically Democrat, I think, in a lot of his perspective. So it's sort of it's certainly one part of the debate, trying to understand this, and it highlights what you said before about the left perceiving that they are sort of less guilty of abusing speech than the right is. And there's a tension there that's hard to unpick whether or not that's true, if that impression is something that is sort of borne out by statistics, etc. We don't know. But there's this, it is certainly increasingly that seems to be the narrative, and it's certainly the narrative that Hasan works with. Now, what I thought was really interesting was that he doesn't discuss speech as an embedded right. It's more like he's just assuming that because we can speak freely now and we can speak cheaply now on the internet, that speech is the same kind of speech that has been defended in democratic theory earlier. It's this sleight of hand where the speech that John Stuart Mill defends ardently on liberty, deeply embedded in the institution of the press, is equated to the speech where I sit in front of my computer and write something on the World Wide Web. But those are completely different institutional contexts. Is there something there where we need to go back and sort of re-understand the right of free speech?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm just looking again at the text. I think we don't often look enough at the text. I think this European-US comparison is interesting. And actually, what I hear across a lot of legislative areas in the internet is Americans on the left wanting US law to be more European. If I can say that, I've probably offended a whole bunch of people just there, but the kind of outcomes they want, across a range of legislation, are that it should be more European. And if we look at the foundational text, look, the US First Amendment is in a sense a kind of libertarian view of the world. It's not a positive assertion or classic sort of positive assertion of the right to free expression. It's actually a restriction placed on the government, is expressed as a restriction on what we want government not to do. So there's an underlying assumption that we have the right to free speech and a fear that government would infringe upon that. And this is written at a time where, people in the US had engaged in seditious rebellion against an oppressive government, the British government, and they had to assert their rights to religion, to assembly, to having a wide range of political opinions. And so what they're saying is, look, now we've got our own Congress, we're going to bind Congress's hands. So we're going to say, Congress, you shall not have the ability to legislate to restrict our freedom of expression, our freedom of religion, etc. So it's expressed in this sort of binding Congress way. And then from that, stems a whole bunch of other things. If you look at the corresponding European Convention on Human Rights, right, Article 10, the European Convention on Human Rights, that actually starts with a positive assertion that you do have the freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart them without interference, but then goes on to say, but the exercise of these freedoms can be restricted as prescribed by law and for reasons that are necessary in a democratic society, and then lists a whole bunch of different reasons, including public safety and national security and so on. So that's quite a different way of doing things. It's saying, we're recognizing that you do have positive right to freedom of expression, but then we're reserving our ability as governments to legislate and take away or chip away at that right, or in some way, moderate it. That's the European version, as opposed to the US one, which is, as I'd describe more as a sort of libertarian position. It's saying, government, back off. You just can't be in this space. You cannot legislate in this area at all. And I think that's then led to really, really, quite different ways of seeing the world. And what I hear sometimes from people sort of more on the left in the US is they almost would be more comfortable with the European version, that there is a generalized right. But there are these things that are in the public interest where that speech is, it's just beyond, it's gone too far. It's destabilizing society. And the European language of Article 10 exactly gives you that test. Don't restrict a government unless you can prove that the speech is having some kind of harmful effect on society. And here's a list of ways in which you can prove that. And you need to pass that hurdle before you can do the restriction. Having passed the hurdle, you're entitled to restrict. US Congress, never entitled to restrict. Doesn't matter how bad the speech is.
And it's quite fascinating because it seems to almost mirror. You can imagine having this discussion about the Second Amendment as well, right? The right to bear arms, right? Where there's an analogy. They seem to be similar in the shape that the debate is evolving, and also the tension between the US and Europe, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot. So the Bill of Rights, if you look at it, I probably offend a whole bunch of US legal scholars here as well. But when I read it, I read it as of its time, and of its time, what it was saying is, look, here's a bunch of ways in which we fear, having liberated ourselves from the evil British regime, which did restrict all of these things. They restricted our right to bear arms and to speak freely and to have our own religions. We want to make damn sure that our new government is not able to do those things. So it is expressed in as a series of limitations and constraints you're placing on the government, as opposed to, as I say, in a sense, sort of asserting positive rights. It's saying, our rights are going to be upheld by tying the hands of government, which is very different, completely different, actually, from the way in which the other conventions on human rights are framed.
And it's in particular, I think it's interesting because what it does also is that it ignores the motivation behind the rights, the functionality of the right as such. Because if you're asserting a right positively, then I think at some point you will have to have a discussion about why this right is worth protecting as a fundamental right. But if you're only limiting the ability of the government to restrict that right, then the right is taken for granted. And that's, of course, a part of the constitutional style of thinking that comes over in a lot of the American legislation. I'll just join you in offending a lot of people here. And I think that's interesting because to a large degree, I think that difference is going to continue to play out between the US and Europe. And you can imagine that the European legislation around speech is going to become more and more akin to the European legislation around, for example, arms or guns. It's going to be detailed. It's going to be quite sort of prescriptive in some places. It's going to be focused on harm, as you have pointed out before, and potential harm. Whereas the US is going to struggle to do that, also because they, in their jurisprudence and the case law from the Supreme Court, as Hassan points out in his book, have taken quite a strong stance on protecting the First Amendment. So that tension will only increase over time, creating two very different universes of speech, it seems.
That's right, and one, interesting as you look at them, because the US one is so specifically about binding the government, binding Congress, it then sort of doesn't have much to say about private companies, and we have this whole debate with this. There's lots of people who sort of do bad First Amendment takes. Who'll kind of go, people kind of go, well, Twitter must respect the First Amendment, and Facebook must, and then people will come back and go, no, read the First Amendment. It talks about Congress. It doesn't say anything about social media companies or anybody else. It doesn't in any way restrict them. I think arguably the European Convention type rights are much more ready to be rolled over onto private companies than the US one. The US one is very specifically Congress can't do these things, silent on what private companies can do. And then the debate shifts towards private companies. And in the Cheap Speech book, a lot of the recommendations are saying, recognizing that Congress won't do these things, we need private companies to do them. Come to Europe, and there's much more of a view of, look, we need alignment between government, law, and private companies. They all need to operate on the same principle being you have a right to freedom of expression, except that it may be constrained by both government and private companies in order to limit these harms. So if a private company like a Facebook or a Google essentially applied the Section 10 or the Article 10 test in the same way that if they applied the privacy test, the privacy rights in the European Convention say you have a right to privacy, except governments may override that right to privacy in these circumstances. And so really, I think what Europeans are doing is saying to companies, we want you to apply consistently the Article 10 type freedom of expression test in your company rules, just as we will do in our law, and these two can nicely align. In the US, on the other hand, ain't never going to align because the public law, isn't interested in carrying out those balancing tests. Freedom of expression except where it causes harm. That's not something that US law does. US law does, you've got freedom of expression. Full stop. and companies may apply a test, but that test is going to look very different. It's not the First Amendment standard in quotes.
And it's two mental models. One is that this right is absolutely given and needs no motivation further than that it's given and universally recognized. And the other model is much more constructive. This is a right that we collaborate to construct. It's an institution that we uphold as a society. And as a company, you're a part of society. We expect you to uphold this institution in what you do, just as we as citizens and governments uphold the institution as well, which sort of comes back to this discussion then about the function of the institution. What is it good for? It's a question that's sort of easier to ask in the European framework than in the US framework. And again, we're getting back to this notion of cheap speech and the decoupling of the amount of speech, the freedom of speech in a society and its democratic robustness or quality or functionality. Do you think that there is, just out of curiosity, do you think that there is such a thing as too much speech? Or do you think that that's asking the wrong question?
I do think that's the wrong question. So I think, again, that's I was thinking of this before, and I was thinking of that sort of comparison, say, of the French election cycle and the American election cycle, just as a way of trying to tease out whether it's the speech that's the issue or the platforms that are the issue that sort of claimed. And I actually think our friend Larry Lessig's model, again, is really, really helpful to look at this when you're looking at, architecture, law, customs or mores and market forces. And so if you look at the French election, the French election was hotly contested. There was a little bit of whinging, I think, from the losing party, but generally everyone sort of moved on and they've accepted that the result as it is. And then you compare that with the US, where there's this sort of massive frenzy and to say the attack on the Capitol, which is the center of the Cheap Speech book. And so is it the speech that is different or is it something else that's different? And I actually think it's all of those factors that end up shaping the speech, which does cause things to be quite different. So in the US, for example, I think, we've already expressed it through the First Amendment, the law is not limiting what people can say in any meaningful way. In France, the law certainly does limit in a much more meaningful way. I mean, just during the election campaign, you cannot buy advertisements in France, paid for advertisements, because the law just forbids it. The sort of claims that the US folks were making about, elected officials and voting companies, if you made those claims in France, they were, what's the polite expression, they would sue the arse off you. I mean, you wouldn't, you would touch the ground. You'd be in like lots of trouble because there's plenty of law that would allow people to take action. So the laws are very different. The market is very different. and again, candidly, there's a lot more money, I think, to be made in America by pushing, misinformation and things like that out there. There's what's his name? That guy who ran Infowars, Alex Jones, wasn't it? He built a whole multi-million-dollar business out of it. I think it's much harder in France. There's some market. Italy certainly had a market around the 5-star movement, but I think there's less money in it. So the market forces are, I think, a considerable material factor. And then Moret's really quite critical. And I think, again, in the book, he does recognize this, that weirdly in the US, by being more, doggedly partisan, you actually win support, whereas in other countries you would lose it. So if Marine Le Pen, having had her initial win, had kept going in the same way that the Republicans have kept going, or Trump's Republicans anyway, I think the reason they wouldn't have done that is the French people would have told them enough's enough. And I certainly remember going out. I represent a party that's very anti-Brexit, and I remember going out after the Brexit campaign, well over, and we were, kind of lobbying to overturn the result, and it wasn't fair. We were cheated, and you'd knock on the doorsteps, and people say to you, "Look, I hate Brexit as well, and I would normally support your party, but as long as you're whinging about the result and trying to overturn it, I'm not going to vote for you because it's fair and square. We should just move on." And again, that's utterly sort of diametrically opposed to the attitude in the US, where it seems that to win Republican votes, you have to, keep saying that you think the election was robbed. You don't lose by doing that; you win by doing it. So the mores are fundamentally different. And then the last piece will be the architecture, just literally the architecture of the social media platforms and things, where in a sense, it's a common architecture for the big platforms between France and the US. I don't think the architecture is the determining factor. It still has an impact, and a lot of the complaints the French and Europeans have is that an American architecture is being imposed upon them. But actually, I say, if you look at those two different worlds, it suggests that we shouldn't neglect, we shouldn't take the architecture as determinative, and we should very much look at the mores. We should look at the market, and we should look at the laws as also these critical factors affecting the way that speech goes. So it's not about quantity, it's quality, I think I'm talking about here. But I think the quality of speech is affected by all of those four things. And if you change the quality, which again, I think he's arguing for in cheap speech, if you can kind of upgrade the quality, then that's more important, I think, than worrying too much about the quantity.
And I think another way of framing this is to say that if you just look at the two-dimensional relationship between the robustness of a democracy and the amount of speech, you miss all of these other dimensions that you describe. And I think one of them is the institutional embedding, that speech needs to exist in a context. It's not too cheap. It's too disembedded and disconnected from the mores or even the architecture in some ways. And as you point out, paradoxically, it's not cheap at all because you can make a lot of money out of it. Yeah. So it might have been cheaper to produce, but it's not cheap in the sense of what the market is willing to pay for it. So there's another dynamic there. So it's and I think it's important to explore this in depth, because if you end up saying there's too much speech, then you're giving yourself a carte blanche to go back to a few elite arenas where people can speak and just say that these are the arenas where we will have the public conversation or where the public sphere will reside. That seems to me to be very limiting and not especially constructive. I think the more constructive approach is figuring out, okay, if there is all of this speech here, what is it? What kinds of institutions do we need in order to make sure that we can see what's good and what's bad and raise quality to the top? It's this old metaphor about the marketplace of ideas and having to redesign some of the market mechanisms in order for it to work, together with the mores and the legislation. So it's and that brings us back to Elon Musk. Let's say that you're advising Mr. Musk, which I understand is something that's terribly hard to do from what I've heard, but then you were advising Elon Musk on his successful purchase of Twitter. It's all been cleared, and he just wants to know what are the three big things I should change about Twitter in the next 12 to 18 months. What's your? It's a horrible question. I shouldn't have sprung that on you, but let's.
I think I would be clear about the identity that you want for the platform, and I would really, really strongly counsel against this. Against the idea that you don't have to make choices. I think that's what gets you into trouble. You end up swinging from sort of one end of the spectrum to the other, because you make a you think you can satisfy both ends. You get criticized by one end, you swing the other direction, you then get reverse criticism, you swing back, and that I think is really helpful. So deciding what you want, and I thought his statement, well, if 10% of people at either end are equally unhappy, that's actually no. Like that is, that's not deep thinking about the problem. that's not a great place to be. Just, if everybody hates you, that's not a great place to be. I think having your identity. So I think, a liberal Twitter or a conservative Twitter or a libertarian Twitter, like those are clear identities you could have. But I think you need to kind of pick one. That's what you've got to do, is decide what kind of identity you want for the platform. And then you've pissed off a certain group of people, but I think you need to go ahead and do that. So that's one piece of advice. I think you'll get there in the end, I think is the point. That so better to sort of do it proactively, really think through, what is your message? What is it you dislike? Do you, for example, think that there's a sort of hot issue of the day? Are you highly intolerant of speech that trans people feels undermines their identity and is directly personally threatening and psychologically harmful? Like it's an interesting sort of case study, because there's a group of people who really feel very strongly that speech shouldn't be there. So yes or no, and you can go through a whole series of different things. Actually, we used to have some of the work that we used to do around content standards at Facebook. We'd have a whole series of slides of statements or images, and you'd have to say yes or no. And once you've done that, and you've figured out yes or no, you now then perhaps can get towards what your identity actually is. So I think be really concrete, yes or no to these things. Get away from these generalities like, well, I piss everyone off equally, that's fine, or just be really clear about where your identity is, and what rules you want will flow from that. So that's probably lesson one. And then lesson two, or question two, I think, to address is this business model question. Like, are you an advertising platform or not? They're relatively small as an advertising platform compared with the others, but that is pretty much all the money they have made. But they don't have to be an advertising platform. They could be all sorts of things. They could be a data broker, frankly. They already offer fire hoses of data in a way that the more private, shall we say, social networks don't and couldn't do and shouldn't do. So are they a data broker? Are they selling people insights into data trends? Are they a media publishers platform? There are rumors that he wants to charge people. If it's primarily a broadcast platform, do you charge people to do broadcasting over your platform? So a number of different models, but again, be really clear which one it is. And there's a risk that they'll sort of sway backwards and forwards between these different models. That's probably lesson number two. And then lesson number three, issue number three is decide your position in advance on regulation. So if it is the case that you are philosophically opposed to being regulated by the European Commission and the UK regulator Ofcom, then make that decision now and prepare for your exit from those markets. Or if you want to be in there, start building your compliance team now, start figuring out how you're going to do it, figure out if you're going to have to sort of partition things off so that there are separate rules for UK and EU users because you want to apply different ones, perhaps more permissive ones to US users? Or are you happy taking the UK EU standards and rolling them over to your global user base because you think US users will also benefit from them? But again, make a clear decision which way you want to go rather than sort of stumbling into it, stumbling out of it, and ending up in trouble. So 3 lessons. What kind of platform do you want to be in terms of content standards? Use some examples to really define that for yourself. What's your identity? What's your business model? Is it ads or is it something else? And what's your approach to regulatory compliance? Are you going to play the game or do you want to fight it? Do you want to opt out of that game? And then start planning for that now because it's going to hit you very, very quickly.
And then he has to do all of that within a power law framework where 10% of the users produce 80% of the content and have 80% of the followers. So as he remodels this, he really needs to think about who his audience is. Who is he designing Twitter for? Is it the 10% who actually bring all of the others, who all of the other people follow, and who actually build all of these tweets? Or is he trying to build Twitter, as he has repeatedly said, as a free speech platform? Because that's not, a free speech platform. I'm not sure that's what that is.
Yeah, but I mean, he has the option again. At least for going private, there is this obsession with user numbers when you're a public company. So he has the option of losing users, which is very hard for public companies to do. And there is the option again. How do we feel about this from a free speech point of view? But he has the option of saying, look, you can pay to speak, but you can listen for free. And so you can be a Twitter user, but if you want the right to speak on the platform, at that point you have to start paying me money. And maybe the more you speak and the more audience you have, the more you pay me. There's something in there. Not free. It's free in one sense, as in anybody with money. If it could be free in the sense of you've got the money, you can speak, but it ain't free in the other sense of there is a sort of cash barrier, paywall for the speaker rather than the reader that he would erect. Again, it's conceptually worth modeling that out.
And would neatly solve the problem of cheap speech too, because it wouldn't be cheap anymore.
It wouldn't be cheap anymore, and right. And the Russian bots, unless the Russian bot farms, wanted to pay him a lot of money, so we're getting some weird situation.
Maybe in rubles.
Yeah. Well, they wouldn't be able to pay at the moment. There'd be sanctions. So, but you'd certainly that.
Oh yes.
You get rid of that phenomenon. But yeah, you end up in some weird world where Europeans are buying Russian gas and oil to send money there so that the Russian government can spend it on bot farms who send the money back to Elon Musk and Twitter. Yeah.
You could not make this stuff up. You could not make this stuff up. Oh, well. Thank you for this. I think we will conclude by saying that it's certainly going to be exciting times ahead, and tracking closely where Twitter is evolving is going to, I think, impact a lot of the free speech discussion, and that's why we're so focused on it. So you can find this episode on your website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
Perfect. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we hope that you will be with us next time.